He wasn't supposed to survive. The words echoed in the quiet night, a truth no one expected, not even the Marine lying unconscious on the cold ground. His body was broken, battered by the relentless violence of war, yet there was one force that refused to give up on him. A German shepherd stood beside him, his eyes locked with the Marines, his body rigid with determination. This wasn't just a story of survival. This was a story of loyalty, a bond forged in the fires of battle, a promise made that would not be broken. Max, the dog, had seen it all, the horrors of war, the bloodshed, the pain, but through it all, he had never left his handler's side. Even now, as the storm raged around them, Max stood as the last line of defense, his presence a silent vow to the man who had once saved him. The cold wind howled through the barren landscape, but Max didn't budge. He couldn't. His handler, John Carter, was all that mattered. The world could fall apart, but he would stay. Max's eyes scanned the darkness, alert to every movement, every sound. He wasn't afraid. He had seen too much to fear. He was simply waiting for the right moment to act, to do what he had been trained to do. But tonight, it wasn't about the battlefield or the mission. It was about the man he had sworn to protect. As the minutes stretched into hours, Max never wavered. John, unconscious and barely alive, stirred slightly, his breath shallow, his body cold. The quiet seemed endless, the stillness broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional flash of lightning. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The storm was fierce, but Max's loyalty was fiercer. He moved closer to his handler, his warm body offering what little comfort he could in the cold, cruel night. Max's fur was soaked, his muscles aching from the hours of waiting, but he didn't mind. He had been trained to endure. He had been trained to save lives. And as the night dragged on, Max never once considered leaving John behind. Not when it mattered most. Not when the bond they shared was stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a faint sound broke through the storm. A low, guttural growl escaped Max's throat. His ears perked up at the sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. The faint outline of a figure appeared through the mist, but Max didn't wait. He surged forward, pushing through the darkness, his instincts guiding him. There was no time to waste. His handler needed him, and he would not fail him now. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, but Max never hesitated. His focus was unyielding, his body brimming with purpose as he darted through the darkened forest, his nose leading him forward. He had trained for moments like this, moments when every instinct, every skill honed through years of service, was tested to the limit. He had been by John's side through countless missions, and tonight was no different. Max was not just a dog, he was family. As the figure in the distance drew closer, Max's growl deepened, a warning for anyone who dared approach his fallen handler. The silhouette became clearer, a man, tall and rugged, his footsteps purposeful as he neared the clearing. Max stood his ground, his amber eyes locked on the newcomer. But there was no threat here. The man slowed as he reached Max, recognizing the loyal K-9 immediately. "Easy, boy," the man muttered softly, crouching to meet Max's gaze. It was Lieutenant Kyle Evans, a fellow Marine who had served with John before, though their paths had diverged after the last deployment. Kyle's face was weathered, his eyes tired, but there was a calmness to his presence. He had been searching for John, knowing that his friend was out there somewhere, waiting for help. And now, here he was, finally within reach. Max's growl subsided, and for a moment, he simply watched the lieutenant, assessing him as if deciding whether to trust him. The bond between John and Max was not something that could be easily understood by anyone who hadn't been there, but Kyle knew. He had seen it firsthand. "We're getting him out of here," Kyle said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Max's tail twitched ever so slightly, a sign of his acknowledgement. Without a word, Kyle moved closer to John, checking his pulse and breathing, grateful to find that his friend was still alive, though barely. The storm raged around them, but the night seemed to hold its breath as Kyle carefully lifted John into his arms. Max followed close, behind, never straying far from his handler. The journey back to the base would be treacherous, but there was no time to waste. Max's ears remained alert, his keen senses picking up every sound, every shift in the wind. The storm was only growing stronger, but Max was undeterred. He knew what he had to do. As they made their way through the dense woods, Kyle did his best to keep John stable, but it was clear that the man's injuries were severe. Every step was a struggle, and the weight of the mission pressed heavily on Kyle's shoulders. He couldn't afford to fail. The storm howled in the distance, but Max kept his pace, the light from Kyle's flashlight flickering through the darkness. As the minutes passed, Max's determination seemed to fill the air, his presence a silent promise that they would make it through. And then, just when it seemed like hope was slipping away, Max let out a soft whine. Kyle paused, looking down at the dog. Max's eyes were locked on John, his body close to his handlers, as if urging Kyle to move faster. It was the push Kyle needed. He nodded, setting his jaw, and quickened his pace, knowing that with Max by his side, they had a chance. The journey was far from over, but as the storm raged and the night seemed endless, the bond between man and dog was the light that would guide them home. The wind howled, and the rain poured down harder, the darkness almost swallowing them whole. But Kyle and Max moved forward, undeterred by the storm that seemed to rage against them. John, though unconscious, was still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Every step Kyle took felt heavier, the weight of John's injuries pressing down on him like a constant reminder of the fragility of life. He could feel Max's presence beside him, the dog's paws softly padding through the mud, his breath steady and measured. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but they weren't there yet. There was still a long way to go before they could reach safety. Every now and then, Max would glance up at Kyle, his amber eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. He didn't need words to know what was at stake. The bond they shared was far deeper than anything that could be described. Max had been there through thick and thin, through moments of triumph and failure, always by his handler's side. The dog's loyalty never wavered, and tonight was no different. As the rain beat down harder, Kyle quickened his pace. The light from the flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the mist ahead. He could barely see, but he knew the path they were on. It was familiar, a route they had taken together in the past, a route that had once been full of camaraderie and purpose. Now, it was nothing more than a blur in the darkness, but it was the only path they had. Kyle's muscles ached, his body already exhausted from the hours of carrying John, but he kept moving. He had no choice. There was no giving up, not now, not when they were so close. He glanced down at John, still unconscious, still fighting for every breath. His heart ached. The man had been through so much, yet here he was, still hanging on, still fighting to survive. Kyle's thoughts were interrupted by a soft whine from Max. The dog had stopped walking, his body tense, ears perked up. Kyle froze, listening closely. There was something in the air, a sound, a movement. Max's instincts were razor sharp, and if he had stopped, it was for a reason. Kyle slowly crouched beside him, looking into the dog's eyes. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max's gaze shifted toward the trees in the distance, his growl low and steady. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. He reached for the rifle strapped to his back, instinctively readying himself for whatever might come next. But Max remained calm, his eyes never leaving the trees. There was no immediate threat, no immediate danger, but Kyle knew better than to ignore his canine's instincts. After a long pause, Max took a cautious step forward, as if silently urging Kyle to follow. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then nodded, rising to his feet and moving cautiously toward the trees. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both, but the storm seemed to fade into the background as they made their way forward. Max moved silently, his paws barely making a sound against the wet ground, while Kyle moved as quietly as possible, his eyes scanning the shadows. They had no idea what they might encounter, but Kyle knew. One thing for certain, with Max by his side, he wasn't alone. The bond between them was unbreakable, stronger than any storm, stronger than any challenge they might face. As they neared the edge of the trees, Max stopped again, his body tense, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Kyle held his breath, waiting. What they would find next could change everything. The trees loomed ahead, their branches twisting like dark fingers reaching into the sky. Max's body was tense, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows between the trunks. Kyle, too, felt the air change, a charged silence that hung over the forest, pressing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched down beside Max, his breath steady but quick. He knew something was out there. Max, always the first to sense danger, was on high alert, every muscle coiled and ready to react. Kyle trusted the dog's instincts more than anything, and right now, he could feel the weight of that trust pressing down on him. "Stay close," Kyle whispered, his voice barely a murmur. He moved forward, his boots muffled by the wet earth. Every step felt like it could be the one that led to danger, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when John's life was hanging by a thread. Max followed closely behind, never more than a step away from Kyle. The dog's focus was unbroken, his ears twitching as he listened for any sign of movement. They crept deeper into the forest, the trees now so thick that the light from the flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The storm raged above, but the forest seemed to absorb it, leaving them in a quiet, eerie stillness. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence. Max stopped, his body stiffening, eyes locked on the source. Kyle's hand went to his side, instinctively reaching for the rifle. He didn't know what they were about to face, but he knew this moment would define everything. "Max," Kyle whispered, his voice steady but low. "What is it, boy?" Max's low growl vibrated through the air, a clear warning. He wasn't backing down. Kyle squatted down beside him, his eyes searching the shadows. It came again, another rustle, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. This time, it was closer. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. There was something out there, something big. Max's body began to shift, preparing to move, but Kyle held him back with a firm grip. "Wait," he said, just above a whisper. They waited in the silence, the anticipation building with every passing second. Then, from the corner of Kyle's eye, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was another Marine, just as ragged and weathered as Kyle, his face grim and covered in mud. He held up a hand to signal them to stop. "It's okay," the Marine said in a voice hoarse from the storm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Max's growl stopped, but his eyes remained sharp. Kyle didn't lower his guard. "Who are you?" Kyle asked, his voice hard, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The Marine nodded, his face tired but resolute. "I'm here to help," he said. "We've been searching for you." The tension in Kyle's shoulders eased just a fraction, but he still didn't trust this stranger. "Not yet. Where's the rest of your team?" Kyle asked, his grip tightening on the rifle. The Marine's eyes flicked to the ground for a moment, then back up to meet Kyle's gaze. "There's no one else," the Marine said, his voice low. "We've been looking for survivors." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of what they meant. There was no one left. Just Kyle, John, Max, and now this stranger, lost in the vastness of the storm. But Kyle didn't have time to process it. His thoughts went straight back to John, still unconscious, still depending on him. "We need to get to the base," Kyle said, his voice firm. "John's hurt bad. We don't have much time." The Marine nodded. "Follow me," he said, stepping forward into the darkness. Kyle hesitated, glancing down at Max, who gave a single nod as if to say, "We trust him." With that, Kyle and Max followed the stranger through the forest, the storm still howling around them, but their path now clearer than ever. The air grew heavier as they moved deeper into the woods, the silence broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the leaves and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Kyle kept his eyes fixed on the Marine ahead, his senses heightened, alert to every movement. Max trotted silently beside him, his gaze darting between the path ahead and the surrounding shadows. The forest was dense, but the Marine in front of them moved with the ease of someone who knew the land well. "We're almost there," the stranger said, his voice low and steady. Kyle nodded, his thoughts racing. His body ached, exhaustion settling in his bones, but he couldn't let himself falter now. John was still unconscious, still hanging on to life by a thread, and it was up to Kyle to get him to safety. He couldn't afford to let any distraction, any hesitation, take him off course. The storm hadn't let up, and the ground beneath their feet was becoming more treacherous with each step. Max, always ahead of them, seemed to glide effortlessly through the mud, his senses guiding him through the night. Kyle couldn't help but admire the dog's unshakable focus. Max had been by his side through so many impossible situations, and tonight, it was no different. They were a team, and nothing was going to break their bond. The Marine in front of them suddenly stopped, and Kyle nearly collided with his back. "There's a clearing up ahead," the Marine said. "It's not far from here, but we'll need to move quickly." Kyle gave a sharp nod, his grip tightening on the rifle slung across his back. "Lead the way," he replied, his voice firm. The Marine didn't hesitate. He took off again, and Kyle followed, his boots splashing through puddles and mud as he pressed on. Every minute felt like an eternity, and Kyle knew that they were racing against time. John needed help, and the faster they got to safety, the better. The rain poured down even harder now, soaking them through, but Kyle didn't notice. His focus was singular, his eyes trained on the back of the Marine ahead. The storm could rage all it wanted. They were moving forward. Max suddenly stopped, his ears perked, his body rigid. Kyle came to an immediate halt, his heart skipping a beat. The dog's behavior had changed. Max was sensing something, and that meant trouble. Kyle's eyes scanned the surrounding forest, his senses heightened. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max growled softly, low and rumbling. Kyle's heart raced. Something was wrong. The Marine in front of them also paused, his head swiveling as if sensing the same shift. In the air, "We need to hurry," the Marine said urgently, his tone sharp. "There's something wrong here." Kyle didn't need any further explanation. He stepped forward, keeping his eyes on Max, who was now moving again, his pace quickening as if he had caught a scent. Kyle picked up his own pace, following the dog's lead. The path ahead grew narrower, the trees crowding in on them as the rain continued to fall relentlessly. Max was moving faster now, his body low to the ground, his senses fully engaged. Kyle felt a pang of urgency in his chest. They were so close. Just a little farther, and they would be out of the woods. Then, out of nowhere, Max suddenly stopped. The dog's growl was louder now, and his body was vibrating with tension. Kyle froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Ahead of them, there was movement, something large, something heavy. It was too dark to make out, but Kyle could feel it. The air felt thick, heavy with danger. The Marine ahead of them turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Get ready," he said, his voice low and tense. Kyle nodded, his pulse quickening. There was no turning back now. Whatever was ahead, they would face it together. Kyle and Max had been through too much to let anything tear them apart. Max's growl turned into a bark, sharp and clear, as the figure in the shadows moved closer. Kyle's grip tightened around his rifle, and he prepared himself for whatever was coming next. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, its outline becoming clearer with every passing second. Kyle's heart raced, his grip tightening on his rifle as he prepared for whatever was about to happen. Max, ever vigilant, stood by his side, his growl now silent, but his body tense with readiness. Kyle's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but there was something else in the air, something unnatural. The Marine in front of them looked just as uneasy, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. "Stay sharp," the Marine whispered, his voice low but urgent. Kyle nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tension broke. The figure emerged fully from the darkness. It was another Marine, just like them, but his eyes were wild, his movements erratic. His uniform was torn, dirt-streaked, and his face was pale as if he hadn't seen the light of day for a long time. Kyle's first instinct was to raise his rifle, but something in the man's eyes made him hesitate. "Who are you?" Kyle called out, his voice steady but cautious. The stranger's lips parted, but it was as if the words wouldn't come. He stumbled forward, his breath ragged, his hands shaking. I was," his words trailed off, swallowed by the storm. Kyle's eyes narrowed. The man didn't seem like a threat, but something was off. The Marine finally took another step forward, his voice cracking. "I'm alone. I've been looking for help." Kyle lowered his rifle slightly, his posture relaxing just a fraction. The stranger didn't appear dangerous, just broken, exhausted, lost. But still, the air between them was thick with uncertainty. "Where's your unit?" Kyle asked, his voice quieter now. The stranger hesitated, his eyes darting around the clearing as if expecting something to jump out at him. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're all gone." I couldn't," his voice faltered. Kyle's brow furrowed. This wasn't right. "What happened to them?" he asked, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. The man's eyes filled with fear, his hands trembling as he clutched at his chest. It was the storm. It came so fast. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I couldn't save them. Kyle's heart sank. He had seen too much of this in the field, too many soldiers who had been left behind, too many lives lost. But this man was different. There was something in his eyes, something that made Kyle's instincts kick in. Where are you going? Kyle asked, his voice firm again. The stranger blinked at him, as if the question hadn't fully registered. I don't know, he said, shaking his head. I need to find them. I need to. His voice cracked again, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Kyle took a step closer, placing a firm hand on the man's shoulder. You're not alone, he said, his tone steady. We'll get through this together. The words felt hollow even as they left his mouth, but he meant them. He had to. The stranger looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. You'll help me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle nodded, though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were running out of time, and with every passing minute, the storm outside seemed to grow stronger. But Kyle wasn't going to leave anyone behind. Not now. Not when there was still a chance. Max let out a soft bark, as if sensing the shift in the air, and Kyle glanced down at him. The dog's amber eyes met his, full of trust and understanding. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The rain fell harder now, a constant drumbeat on the wet earth beneath their feet. Kyle, Max, and the stranger continued moving through the forest, the trees barely visible through the thick fog that surrounded them. Every step felt like a small victory, but Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. John's condition was deteriorating, and the storm was relentless, its ferocity growing with every passing minute. The stranger moved ahead of them, his eyes darting nervously around, but his steps were steady, as though he was trying to convince himself that he wasn't truly alone. Max walked beside Kyle, ever watchful, his body low to the ground, his ears perked at every sound. The dog's presence was a comfort, a silent reminder that they had something worth fighting for. Kyle glanced down at Max, his eyes filled with determination. The dog met his gaze, his amber eyes reflecting the same resolve. They were a team, and together, they could face anything. As they moved deeper into the forest, the wind began to pick up again, howling through the trees like a warning. The path they followed seemed to get steeper, the terrain more uneven, but Kyle's resolve never wavered. He could hear John's ragged breathing, shallow and slow, a constant reminder that time was running out. They had to keep moving. The stranger stopped suddenly, his head turning as he looked into the thick fog. What is it? Kyle asked, his voice low, his hand on the rifle at his side. The stranger's face was pale, his eyes wide. I thought I saw something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle squinted, trying to see through the fog, but it was impossible. Stay close, Kyle ordered, his voice firm. We can't afford to get separated. Max growled softly, his body tense as he scanned the shadows. There was something in the air, something that made Kyle's instincts flare. The stranger's eyes darted around nervously, but he didn't speak. Instead, he moved closer to Kyle, his body pressed tight against the Marine's. Kyle could feel the stranger's fear, but there was no time to address it. They had more pressing matters. We need to get to the clearing, Kyle said, his voice low but steady. It's not far now. They pushed forward, the weight of the storm bearing down on them, the air thick with tension. Every footstep felt like it could be their last, but they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop. The fog seemed to press in closer, the trees blocking any view of the sky above, leaving them in a world of shadows. And yet, Kyle kept moving, following the stranger's lead, trusting that they were on the right path. Max, always a few steps ahead, stopped once more. This time, his head was raised, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His growl was louder now, more insistent. Kyle felt his heart skip a beat. What is it, boy? He whispered. Max's growl deepened as he stepped forward, his body tense, every muscle coiled in readiness. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as he reached for his rifle. Something was out there, something that Max sensed but they couldn't see. The fog seemed to swirl around them, thickening until Kyle could barely see the outline of the stranger ahead. He raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the shadows, his heart racing. Then, from the mist, a figure appeared. It was barely a silhouette, but it was enough to send a wave of unease through Kyle. The figure moved toward them, slow, and deliberate. Kyle's finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle, his muscles coiled, ready to act. But then the figure spoke, and it was a voice Kyle recognized. "It's me." The voice called out, ragged and worn. "I'm here." The figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be another Marine, haggard and covered in mud, his face drawn and tired. Kyle lowered his rifle, his breath escaping in a sharp rush. It was one of his own. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The storm, the fog, the tension in the air. The stranger who had been leading them through the woods stood frozen, his eyes wide with confusion and surprise. "Who are you?" the newcomer asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man gave a tired smile, his eyes flicking from Kyle to the stranger. "I'm part of the unit," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been looking for survivors. We've been trying to find you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Kyle stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're with the unit?" he asked. The man nodded, but there was something in his expression that didn't sit right with Kyle. Something that made him wary. Still, the urgency of the situation pushed Kyle forward. "Where's the rest of your team?" he asked, his voice firm. The man's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, a shadow passed over his face. "They're gone," he said softly. "I'm all that's left." Kyle looked at the man, his heart heavy with the truth of those words. There was no one left, no reinforcements coming. It was just them. But for now, that was enough. They had each other. They had Max. The fog seemed to thicken around them, a wall of white that obscured everything in its path. Kyle stood still, taking a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The storm had not let up, but now there was something different in the air. A subtle change, a shift. The man who had appeared from the mist was still standing in front of him, eyes locked on the ground, his hands trembling. Kyle's mind raced as he processed everything. The man's appearance, his words, they didn't sit right. There was a crack in the story, something Kyle couldn't quite place. But now was not the time to ask too many questions. John's condition was worsening. Max, ever watchful, stood by his side, his eyes scanning the darkness. Kyle couldn't help but feel the dog's unwavering trust in him, a bond that transcended the chaos of the world around them. Max had always been there for him, and now, in this moment, he needed to be there for Max. "We need to move," Kyle said, his voice calm but firm. The man in front of them nodded, though there was an unease in his eyes. He wasn't ready to move forward, and Kyle could see it. There was hesitation in his every gesture, every breath he took. "Where's the rest of your unit?" Kyle asked again, his voice sharp. The man hesitated, looking around, as if he could find the words somewhere in the trees, or perhaps in the swirling mist. "There's no one left," the man said quietly. "I'm the last one." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The fog, the storm, the chaos. It all seemed to slow, as if the world was waiting for Kyle's response. Kyle couldn't tell if he was lying. His gut told him there was more to the story. But right now, there was no time for suspicion. They needed to keep moving. They needed to survive. "All right," Kyle said, his voice low and steady. "Then let's go." The stranger nodded again, his steps unsteady as he began to move forward, leading the way through the fog. Max, always alert, trotted ahead, his ears flicking at every sound. Kyle followed closely behind, his rifle at the ready. The silence around them was oppressive, the only sound the squelching of their boots in the mud and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Time seemed to stretch, each second a long eternity, each step a small victory against the odds. The stranger led them deeper into the forest, his pace quickening as if the distance was weighing on him. Kyle kept a watchful eye on him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to John. His condition had only worsened since they started, and Kyle couldn't afford to lose him. They couldn't afford to stop now. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the path twisting and turning until Kyle had no sense of direction. The fog had swallowed up everything familiar, leaving only the sound of the storm and the crunch of their footsteps. But then, just ahead, Kyle saw a flicker of light. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was there. A beacon. The clearing was close. His heart picked up pace as he urged Max forward, his eyes fixed on the light ahead. As they drew closer, the figure of a small building appeared through the mist, its shape barely visible, its lights flickering in the storm. A safe house. Kyle's heart surged with a mix of relief and exhaustion. They were so close. They had to be. Max stopped ahead of him, his head held high, ears perked as he sniffed the air. The dog's reaction was immediate, and Kyle felt his pulse quicken. There was something about the way Max stood that told him they weren't quite in the clear yet. Kyle's grip tightened on his rifle as he approached, ready for whatever came next. The man ahead of them paused as well, his back tense. The building was only a few yards away now, but Kyle could feel the unease settling in. "What is it?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head slowly, his face hardening. "We're not alone," he said. The words hung in the air like a warning, and for a moment, everything went still. Kyle felt a chill creep down his spine. The storm raged on, but the threat was real, and they were not yet safe. The tension in the air was thick, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Max stood in front of Kyle, his body rigid, ears pricked, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Kyle felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hand instinctively went to his rifle, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. The man ahead of them, the stranger, stood motionless, his back stiff with fear. "What do you mean we're not alone?" Kyle's voice was low, his words deliberate. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the clearing ahead, his eyes narrowing. "There's something out there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Kyle's senses went into overdrive. Something wasn't right. Max's low growl echoed through the trees, and for a moment, the forest seemed to pulse with a quiet, unspoken threat. Kyle motioned for the stranger to stay close, his mind focused on what was ahead. They were close now, just a few more steps, and they would reach the building. The flickering lights were still visible in the distance, a beacon of hope, but the unease in the air made Kyle hesitate. The fog was thick, swirling around them, making it harder to see. The rain fell relentlessly, but the silence in the forest was unnerving. The only sound now was the steady rhythm of their footsteps, muffled by the wet ground. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on his rifle. Max had stopped again, his head cocked slightly to one side, his nose twitching. The dog was on high alert, his instincts telling him something was coming. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He knew Max wouldn't react like this unless there was something worth worrying about. The stranger looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. "We have to hurry," he muttered. "I don't know how much longer we have." Kyle's mind raced. The man's fear was palpable, but that wasn't enough to sway him. They had a mission, and they couldn't afford to falter now. But the closer they got to the building, the more Kyle felt a sense of foreboding creep over him. They were almost there, but the storm seemed to grow fiercer by the second. The wind howled, the trees swaying violently, and the ground beneath their feet became slick with mud. Max's growl grew louder, and Kyle instinctively took a step back, watching the shadows ahead. There was something moving, something big. Kyle's breath caught in his throat, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. The figure in the mist was barely visible, but it was moving toward them. The fog made it impossible to make out details, but Kyle could feel its presence, looming just ahead. His heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to be ready. But just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it stopped. A cold silence fell over the forest. Max's growl ceased, and the only sound left was the steady patter of rain on the leaves. Kyle's mind raced. Was it an enemy? A survivor? He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the shape ahead. But then, the figure spoke, its voice rough, strained. "It's me," the voice said, barely audible over the storm. "I'm here." Kyle froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was someone he knew. But who? The figure stepped forward, its shape slowly becoming clearer in the dim light. And then, through the mist, Kyle saw him. It was another Marine, but this one was different. He looked just as ragged, just as worn, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Kyle pause. The man's face was dirt-streaked, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his eyes told a different story. There was no fear in them, only determination. Kyle's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How had this man survived? How had he found them? "Where have you been?" Kyle asked, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. The Marine looked back at him, his expression unreadable. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice hoarse. "For all of you." The fog seemed to lift for just a moment, the storm settling slightly, as if the forest itself was waiting for Kyle's next move. He could feel Max's gaze on him, unwavering, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Whatever was happening, whatever was coming, they were not alone anymore. They had a chance. The stranger, the man who had led them this far, looked between Kyle and the new Marine, his face tense. Who is he? He asked. But Kyle didn't answer. Not yet. He couldn't. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. For now, all that mattered was getting through the night. Together, the stranger stood there, his face still etched with exhaustion, but now there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that looked like hope. Kyle watched him closely, trying to piece together the puzzle of their situation. The fog continued to hang thick in the air, the only sounds the distant crash of thunder and the soft rustling of the trees around them. Max remained still, his amber eyes focused on the new Marine, studying him, as if to determine whether he was a threat. Kyle's hand tightened around his rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. He could feel the weight of every moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The rain had slowed, but the chill in the air hadn't lessened. You've been looking for us? Kyle finally asked, his voice calm but filled with suspicion. The new Marine nodded, his gaze steady. I have, he said, his voice hoarse. But I didn't know where to find you. Until now. Kyle didn't know whether to believe him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. But right now, it didn't matter. They had made it this far, and the storm was still out there, just waiting to tear them apart. They needed shelter. They needed to get to safety, and they needed to do it fast. We're almost there, the new Marine continued, his eyes flicking toward the clearing just ahead. Kyle followed his gaze and saw it too. The building. The lights flickered weakly through the fog, but it was a sign, something solid to hold on to. A place where they could regroup, rest, and tend to John. But there was no guarantee that safety awaited them there. The forest around them felt alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. Max let out a low growl, and Kyle tensed, his instincts kicking in. He turned his attention back to the trees, eyes scanning the darkness. The quiet was unnerving. We move together, Kyle said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Keep your eyes open. Stay close. The stranger nodded, stepping forward cautiously. Max stayed by Kyle's side, his movements precise, every muscle taut with anticipation. As they walked toward the clearing, the ground beneath them grew more uneven, the earth slick with rain and mud. The path narrowed, the trees pressing in on all sides. Kyle's grip on his rifle tightened again as the feeling of being watched grew stronger. There was no sound from the stranger now, just the heavy breathing of the three of them as they made their way through the fog. The building ahead grew clearer with each step, the outline of a small cabin emerging from the mist. The windows were dark, but the faint glow of light from inside flickered against the glass. Kyle felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. His thoughts remained focused on John, who was still unconscious, still struggling for each breath. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The cabin was only a few more steps ahead when Max suddenly stopped. The dog's head snapped up, his nose twitching. Kyle froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension building again. Max's growl was low but unmistakable. There was something out there, something close. Kyle motioned for the stranger to stop and stay quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of something bad. For a moment, everything went still. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, Max started forward again, his growl turning into a low bark. Kyle's eyes widened, his hand reaching for his rifle, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The figure that stepped into the clearing wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't a threat. It was someone familiar. A voice called out from the darkness. Kyle, is that you? Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The voice belonged to someone he thought he had lost forever. Sergeant Mitchell? Kyle called out, his voice breaking through the fog. How the hell did you? Mitchell stepped into the dim light, his uniform soaked, his face grim, but his eyes filled with the same unyielding determination Kyle had always known him for. I've been trying to find you, Mitchell said, his voice hoarse but strong. We've got a lot to talk about, but right now, we need to get you out of here. Kyle's mind was racing. It was Mitchell, his old teammate, someone he thought was long gone. But now wasn't the time to dwell on that. There was still so much they needed to do, so much that was uncertain. Get inside, Kyle said, his voice firm, snapping out of the confusion. We're not safe yet. Mitchell nodded and followed them toward the cabin. Max led the way, his nose still twitching, his body tense. Kyle kept a close eye on the surrounding trees, his instincts telling him that they weren't out of danger yet. But for now, they had made it to the clearing. They had made it to safety. And that was all that mattered. The cabin door creaked open, and the harsh wind from outside rushed in, making Kyle shiver for a moment before he closed it quickly behind them. Inside, the air was cold, but it was a welcome change from the wet chill of the storm. The light from the single flickering lamp cast long shadows across the rough wooden walls. John was still unconscious, but there was a faint warmth in his skin now, a slight improvement, and for that, Kyle was thankful. The stranger, Mitchell, followed them in, his steps heavy on the creaky wooden floor. He looked just as worn and tired as the rest of them, his uniform dirty and torn, but his presence brought a sense of familiarity and relief. Kyle couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. They weren't alone anymore. You're sure we're safe here? Kyle asked, his voice low but urgent, his eyes scanning the room. Mitchell nodded. For now, yes, he replied, his voice hoarse from the storm. But we need to keep moving once the weather lets up. This place isn't a permanent solution. Kyle understood. They had no choice but to take a moment to regroup, but he knew they couldn't stay here for long. Not with John still struggling, and not with the storm still raging outside. Kyle turned his attention back to John, who was now lying on a small cot, the faintest rise and fall of his chest visible. Max had sat at his side, his eyes never leaving his handler. The dog was as devoted as always, his presence a silent comfort in the midst of the chaos. How bad is it? Mitchell asked, his voice low as he moved to stand beside Kyle. Kyle hesitated for a moment before answering. He's hanging on, but I don't know how long that will last if we don't get him help, he said quietly. Mitchell glanced at John, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything for a moment, as if processing the weight of the situation. We'll get him out of here, Mitchell finally said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. Kyle nodded, feeling a slight relief at the certainty in Mitchell's words. We need to move fast, Kyle said. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. Mitchell gave him a brief look, understanding the urgency in Kyle's voice. I'll help you carry him when it's time, but we have to wait for the storm to pass. Kyle sighed, looking over at the window where the rain continued to hammer against the glass. Outside, the storm was relentless, but inside the cabin, there was at least a semblance of shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a brief respite. For now, all they could do was wait and prepare for what was coming next. The cabin felt strangely quiet, the sound of the storm outside becoming a constant hum in the background. Max finally stood, his tail stiff, his posture alert, his ears flicking at every noise. He was always aware, always on edge, and Kyle appreciated that more than he could express. The dog was his lifeline in moments like this. They had been through hell together, and Kyle knew that no matter what happened, Max would never leave his side. We'll make it through this, Kyle muttered to himself, more to reassure himself than anyone else. He stood up and crossed to the small wood stove, where a pile of firewood sat. They had enough to last for a little while. He started to build a fire, his movements automatic, even as his mind raced with the plans he had to make. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow across the room. Kyle turned back to Mitchell, who was watching him quietly. When the storm passes, we need to get John to the nearest base. We can't wait any longer. Mitchell nodded. Agreed, he said. But we'll need to move quietly. The storm's hiding us for now, but it won't last forever. Kyle gave him a sharp nod. There was no time to waste. We'll wait until first light, Kyle said, his voice steady now. Then we move. He glanced at John, then at Max, who was still sitting watchfully by his side. The dog's eyes met his, and for a moment, Kyle felt a deep sense of gratitude. They weren't alone, and that was all that mattered. The crackling of the fire filled the cabin as Kyle stood in front of the stove, his eyes fixed on the flames, but his mind was elsewhere. He was already planning the next steps. They had to move quickly. Every second counted. John, still unconscious, was laying on the cot, his shallow breathing the only sign that he was alive. Max, as always, was at his side, eyes watchful, alert. The dog's steady presence was a small comfort in the midst of all the uncertainty. Kyle had seen enough to know that nothing was guaranteed. They had no idea what the future held, but they were still here, still fighting. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling and the rain pouring relentlessly, but inside the cabin, it was warm enough to gather their thoughts and prepare for the journey ahead. Kyle turned to Mitchell, who had been standing by the window, keeping watch. The man looked as tired as Kyle felt, his face drawn, his eyes weary. But there was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that reminded Kyle of the Marines he had fought beside. "You sure about this?" Kyle asked, his voice low. Mitchell turned, his eyes locking with Kyle's. "We don't have much choice," he said. "If we stay here, the storm will catch us, or worse. We need to move while we can." Kyle nodded, his gaze shifting to John. "I know," he said, "but we need to be careful. We don't know what's out there." Mitchell's expression softened, and he stepped closer. "We'll get him to safety," he said. "One step at a time." Kyle took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the door. He knew Mitchell was right. They couldn't stay here forever. The storm would eventually clear, and when it did, they needed to be ready. He turned back to the cot, kneeling beside John. Max nudged his hand gently, as if offering reassurance. Kyle's fingers brushed through the dog's fur, the connection between them stronger than words could ever express. They were a team, and Max had never once let him down. The thought of leaving the cabin made Kyle uneasy, but he pushed the feeling aside. They had to move. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Let's get ready," Kyle said, his voice steady. He glanced at Mitchell. "We leave as soon as the storm lets up." Mitchell gave a short nod, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "I'll make sure we're ready to go," he said. Kyle stood up and walked over to the window. The storm outside showed no sign of slowing, but he had learned long ago that waiting for the perfect moment was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had to make their own chance. The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound in the otherwise quiet cabin. As Kyle stood there, watching the storm rage, he thought about everything they had been through to get to this point. The battles, the losses, the moments of doubt. But there was one thing that had never wavered, his determination to get everyone out of this alive. They weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually make it, that they could survive this. Max let out a soft whine, as if sensing the shift in the air. Kyle turned to the dog, his eyes meeting Max's. There was understanding there, a bond that spoke volumes. The storm wasn't finished with them yet, but neither were they. They would get through this, together. Kyle gave Max one last reassuring glance before turning back to Mitchell. "Let's move. When we can," Kyle said. "And we stay together. We're not splitting up." Mitchell nodded again. Agreed. They were ready. They had to be. Kyle turned back to John, checking on him one last time. "We're getting you out of here," he whispered. "Just hang on." The storm had finally begun to ease, though the clouds still hung heavily overhead, blocking out the pale light of dawn. The wind had calmed, leaving behind only the sound of distant thunder and the soft patter of rain on the cabin's roof. Inside, the small fire had died down, leaving the room shrouded in dim light, but the warmth it had provided was enough to give them the strength to move. Kyle stood up from the chair where he had been resting, his muscles stiff from the hours of waiting. The adrenaline that had kept him going through the night was beginning to fade, leaving behind an overwhelming fatigue. But there was no time to rest. John was still unconscious, still struggling for breath, and every moment spent in the cabin was another moment they couldn't afford to waste. Kyle glanced over at Mitchell, who was standing by the window, watching the weather clear. The man was still an enigma, but right now, there was no room for doubt. He had helped them get this far, and they had no choice but to trust him. "It's time," Kyle said, his voice steady but low. Mitchell turned to look at him, his expression grim but resolute. "I know," he replied. "I'll grab the supplies. We move out in 10. Kyle nodded and crossed over to where John lay. Max, ever vigilant, was curled up at his side, his eyes following Kyle as he approached. The dog's tail gave a small wag, a silent sign of reassurance. Kyle crouched beside John, checking his pulse again, feeling the faint but steady rhythm beneath his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to. Kyle spoke quietly to his unconscious friend, though he knew John couldn't hear him. "We're getting you out of here, buddy," he whispered. "Just hang on a little longer." He stood up and moved to the small table in the corner of the room, where a few supplies had been left. Kyle quickly gathered what little they had: a first aid kit, a flashlight, some basic rations. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. When he turned back, Mitchell had already packed up the rest of their gear, his rifle slung over his shoulder, ready to move. Kyle took a deep breath and walked back to John, gently lifting him into his arms. The weight of his friend's body was a heavy reminder of how much they still had to fight for. Max stood up and walked alongside them, his ears flicking at every sound, ever watchful. "We'll move fast," Kyle said, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "Stay close and keep quiet." Mitchell nodded and moved to the door, checking the surroundings outside. The world beyond the cabin was a wash of fog and wet earth, but there was a break in the storm. The path ahead was still treacherous, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. Kyle followed Mitchell out the door, keeping a tight hold on John as they moved through the muddy terrain. The air was cool against his skin, but the chill didn't matter. He had one goal now: to get John to safety. They moved as quickly as they could, navigating through the dense forest, using the trees for cover as the last remnants of the storm faded into the distance. The sound of Max's soft padding on the wet ground was a constant, reassuring presence at Kyle's side. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing, and in the distance, Kyle saw what he had been hoping for: a small outpost, barely visible through the haze. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were closer. They had made it this far. Kyle quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest, as he moved toward the outpost, feeling the weight of his friend's life in his arms. Max's growl broke the silence, low and warning, but Kyle didn't stop. They had come too far to turn back now. "We're almost there," Kyle muttered, pushing forward with everything he had left. The outpost was just ahead. The road to safety was within reach.